And I want to start with the thank yous, which are really important today. First to Professor Alessandra Gribaldo for her generous introduction, and of course to Selenia Marabello for the invitation to speak here today. But like Selenia, I want to also thank Giulia Consoli, hiding in the second row, for setting this event in motion some years ago in Edinburgh. It's been a long time planning and very much look forward to, and I'm really happy to be here. When we first discussed what I might speak about, Dr. Marabello suggested, somewhat alarmingly to me, but also kind of enticingly, that I might deliver a lecture on my whole work, including my most recent research. So I confess it's been a little bit of a challenge to think back over more than 40 years of fieldwork to construct or to try and construct a coherent narrative that links together some of the themes from my work, which Alessandra has already mentioned, over now several decades. But inspired by this suggestion, that's what I'm going to try to do in this lecture. So, what links together a village study of women, kinship, and relatedness conducted in a rural Malay village, fishing village, in the 1980s, with a study of searches undertaken by adult or adoptees for their birth families in Scotland in the 1990s, or a study of the multiple meanings and resonances of blood across different domains, kinship, religious, medical, political, conducted in hospital clinical pathology labs, blood banks, and blood donation sites in urban Penang in the first years of the 21st century. And how might one connect all of that to a study of experiences of middle-class marriage across multiple ethnicities and religions in urban Penang, which is my most recent project. In this lecture, I'm going to focus most of all on this recent research because the other bits you can read about, which has been conducted over the last 6 years. But I will, although as I will discuss, the methods of research have changed considerably over the decades that I've been working. And I want to show how the concerns and questions that underlie this recent work connect back to the earliest doctoral research I conducted on the Malay island of Langkawi in Malaysia in the early 1980s. So these first few pictures were taken in the early 1980s in the village where I did fieldwork on the island of Langkawi. Obviously, one thread that links most, though not all of this work, is Malaysia, where I first went in 1980, and from where somehow I have never quite disentangled myself. I'm going to come back to this aspect of continuity a bit later, although perhaps it's not the theme that most interests you here, but anyway, it's one I've been thinking about. The main connection that draws all of this ethnographic work together, which is given in the title of my talk, is the generativity of everyday kinship and relatedness. And I think here it's worth pausing. There are perhaps two deceptively simple and often overlooked ideas here. The first is that the creativity and productivity of kinship resides not, or at least not necessarily, as we might assume, in extraordinary or exceptional events, sites, or people, but in the everyday. And the everyday aspects of experience, things like, for example, as Alessandra mentioned, sharing a meal, occupying a house space, simple acts of hospitality, are all too liable to be overlooked by anthropologists as boring, humdrum, or inconsequential, or as performed by people who are themselves inconsequential, not singular or special. One of my students once memorably referred to this as the anthropology of brushing your teeth. The second point, linked to the importance of attending to everyday aspects of experience, is the idea that the everyday is itself generative or creative. Far from being without importance, small everyday acts and experiences, on the contrary, have a power to generate habits and memories, patterns of behavior, but laid down over time and cumulatively, sometimes over generations, take on political weight and significance. We can sense this ourselves if we think about our own childhood memories of family meals, perhaps, or shared living space, and of how shared memories of childhood lived in troubled times may assume political importance retrospectively. When I first learned about Malay houses, domesticity, shared meals, and forms of relatedness in the 1980s, I was struck not only by the importance of women to these aspects of experience, but also by the forceful and often coercive nature of hospitality and food sharing. So there was something that you can't refuse, and this is true of hospitality in many parts of the world. It's difficult to refuse, but in the village where I lived, it was particularly obvious to me. So there seemed to be a continuum between the everyday domestic meals that people ate in their houses all the time, more ostentatious and formal feasting, often to celebrate marriages, and certain kinds of quite performative relatedness, especially perhaps in the widespread fostering of children, as well as forms of hospitality shown to adults who were outsiders. Historical demographic research that I conducted on the island of Langkawi a few years later demonstrated how, as in other parts of Southeast Asia, the population was historically mobile. Migration was common, mainly for reasons of poverty and warfare. So the idea that we read in our newspapers every day that somehow the movement of populations is a recent phenomenon, abnormal and disturbing, is, I think, a really one that as anthropologists and historians we need to counter, because in many parts of the world, people were never really very settled where they were born. And certainly Southeast Asia is a case in point. So historical demographic research that I conducted after my original fieldwork showed that the population was very mobile historically. Migration was common mainly for reasons of poverty and warfare. In this demographically fluid context, the supposedly domestic activities of women in terms of cooking, feeding, and fostering, which were also often a more long-term prelude to marriage and settlement, took on a particular importance. Acts of feeding and hospitality performed largely by women had a cumulative historical and political significance. In a highly mobile Malay world, feeding and hospitality enabled outsiders to be incorporated and eventually to settle, processes which were crucial to the establishment and growth of communities through the 19th and early 20th centuries. I just want to pause to comment a little on this photograph, which is, I was very lucky to get. It's the photograph from the cover of a book that Alessandra mentioned about the house. But it shows, I think, rather extraordinarily how not only people but houses could be on the move. And the house here, which was actually being carried from one side of the village to another, is an animated being. It's like it's acquired all these human legs, and it can walk, or in this case, actually run, because houses are very heavy to live. And so the guys underneath were running with it from one part of the village to another. So the generativity of everyday kinship and relatedness was central to describing Malay kinship and to grasping how its forms had developed historically. And this gave a particular significance to those seemingly unmarked processes of living together in a shared house and cooking and eating together. It followed from that houses needed to be considered not just as domestic spaces, but also as public political ones. These processual understandings of kinship and relatedness were crucial background for the formulation of a larger comparative project examining marriage in 5 different locations, only one of which was in Malaysia, almost 4 decades later. This new project focused on everyday experiences of marriage, but the context and methods of research, as I'll explain later, were quite different from the rural Malay village where I'd worked previously. So the next section of this talk, which is going to be quite a long one, is about the marriage project. And I'm going to focus particularly on 2 women that I want to tell you about and the interviews they gave me. So for those of you who don't like very ethnographic parts, you can have a little nap and look at the pictures. But I want to start by taking you into the heart of just one of the locations where we did this research. So this is urban Penang, a very different social world from where I did my first fieldwork. Not rural, obviously, but urban, not peasant, but I was working with very middle-class people. Perhaps most important and striking, not monoethnic Malay, exclusively Muslim, but multi-ethnic, plural, and religiously, culturally very diverse. So these next sequence of pictures are from the center of Old Georgetown in Penang, which has a very dense religious and cultural life. And these are some actual Chinese worshipping sites. So Penang's demographic and cultural diversity far overflows the very reductive categories of Malaysia's government census. These are 3 categories that come up in every context in Malaysia, whether you buy a mobile phone or whatever mundane thing, you're asked to fill in Malay, Chinese, Indian, or other. In fact, all those categories actually break down into, as you can imagine, into multiple other categories. An entrepot trading hub since the late 18th century, when it became a British colony, Penang's population includes descendants of Hadramut Arabs who came as traders to Penang, numerous different Chinese sub-communities belonging to different language groups and originating from different parts of mainly southern China, so-called Nyonya Chinese of mixed Chinese and Malay descent, Hindu Tamils from southern India and what was then Ceylon, but now, of course, Sri Lanka, as well as Indian Muslims. This list of ethnicities, with their histories of migration and displacement, different cultural heritages, languages, dress, and culinary styles is by no means exhaustive. This world is urban Penang, where I conducted research between 2017 and 2022 on middle-class experiences of married life. So this was more or less 40 years after my first fieldwork in Malaysia. Many circumstances of the research, as I'll explain later, were very different. But first, I want to introduce you to two of the many people I got to know during that period. And the next, so the pictures that I'm going to show now don't tie loosely to my, strongly to the text. They are parallel, a parallel narrative, if you like, that just to give you a sense of what urban Penang is like and some of the marriage sites that caught my eye. So, researching marriage in Penang, I interviewed Lydia in August 2018. She had brought along some family photographs, her own wedding album, and other items to show me. Lydia was in her 50s and had grown up, she told me, on rubber estates in different parts of Malaysia. The story of her own and her parents' marriage took her back to her maternal grandparents, who had come to Malaya from China around the turn of the 20th century. Lydia recounted how her grandmother, whose husband had died when the children were still young, had been illiterate and had worked in a cheroot factory to support her family. She had been the victim of a violent attack by her husband's family after his death. So she was kind of redundant family member. This is my friend Lydia's grandmother, and they tried to get rid of her, basically. Lydia proved an articulate and insightful interviewee, interested, enthusiastic, and reflective on her own family history. Her mother, she related, finished primary school and had learned sales and tailoring schools working in a silk store. It was this story that it seemed Lydia really wanted to tell. It's such a phenomenal story, my mother's, she said. The extended family of Lydia's grandfather had run a supply store serving the plantations and had tried to persuade her mother to work there. She was a good salesperson, Lydia said. Unwilling at first, an uncle had eventually persuaded her mother by offering a higher salary. The store, Lydia said, sold imported goods, corned beef and things. All the plantations, the expats, went to that store. The family tried to get her to work in the family shop. She didn't want to. On the other side of her family, Lydia's father had originally come to Malaya in the 1950s on his compulsory military service from the UK during what was then called the Malayan emergency, which I'll explain in a minute. Her father would often come to the store with his best friend. Lydia said, all the young planters would come in because my mum was stunning. She knew everything from the store about all the planters, from what they bought, whiskey or whatever. There are very interesting stories about her. My dad was very private, not very emotional. After his army service, Lydia's father had decided to stay on in Malaysia. He had been to agricultural college, she said. He really liked it here. He decided to stay. He came from a farming family. They married the year I was born. The dates were close. I wondered why. During school holidays, when Dad was working for Dunlop, he wanted to marry my mother. The company wouldn't allow it because she was local. My father moved out of Dunlop to another company which was being localized. By then, he was married and she was pregnant. Lydia described a happy childhood on the estates in which her creativity and that of her siblings had been fostered. Dad wrote diaries and ran experiments the whole time. We had to write diaries and draw. Mum was also very creative in a different way with textiles and cooking. It kept us busy. It was quite isolated on the estate. The adversities of her mother's early life had made a deep impression on Lydia. She spoke with emotion of her grandmother's hardships and of how 3 out of her mother's 4 siblings had died. My mother wanted to get out of her nightmare family and have an easier family. While Lydia's father had not faced such dramatic circumstances, it seemed that he too had escaped a difficult family life in England to fetch up as a planter on rubber estates in late colonial Malaya as it emerged into independence. Growing up with parents from very different backgrounds had left its traces. Lydia said, "We never joined any clubs, expat clubs. He stayed away from them. I think he was really upset at the idea that locals were not allowed. They spoke English from the beginning, my parents. My mother learned English at school. It was all in English then. When they first married, they might have gone back to the UK, but it never happened. Dad spoke Bahasa, which is the national language in Malaysia, but on the estate, it was all English. My mother's mother tongue was Hokkien. We spoke Bahasa to her mother. She couldn't speak English. Bahasa was the common language. So you get the idea of a family speaking 3 or 4 languages together, which is very common in contemporary Malaysia. As we pored over photographs of her parents' early 1960s small wedding, she described it, at which her father's best friend had been the only guest, Lydia related how the marriage of her parents had been a happy one. They had maintained contact with her maternal grandmother, who had carried on living with her marital family until her death. Lydia strongly conveyed her respect and admiration for the resilience of her mother and maternal grandmother. My dad found my mother. She was very pretty, but very strong, and came from an unprivileged background. So strong and very practical, she said. We looked too at a more elaborate album that Lydia had made, assembling wedding pictures, scraps of fabric, and handwritten wishes for the couple. It seemed to echo some of her father's beautifully illustrated personal journals that he had kept for many years while working on the estates. Describing her own marriage, Lydia told me about how she and her future husband, Michael, had entered a creative business partnership together several years before they married. We were a couple from the beginning. We fell into being a couple very easily, the same background, so much in common. The crossover with plantations, so it was very easy. She spoke of a similarity between the marriage of her parents and those in her own generation in her family. All the marriages are quite similar, she said, couples who have worked together. As she spoke about her own marriage and children, Lydia conveyed how she had established a life that reproduced themes from her background, married life as a working enterprise, a nurturing of creative talents across the generations. And here, a more equal balance seems to have been struck that avoided the violence and hardship of earlier generations. The second interlocutor to whom I want to introduce you came from a quite different background. I met Harriet quite late in my research and interviewed her in 2019 at her local Gurdwara, so Sikh temple. So we've switched from Anglo-Chinese Malaysian to something quite different. So Harriet's mother was originally from India and had come to Penang to marry. Her father had been born in Penang. In her 50s, Harriet struck me as an admirably forceful and talkative woman with strongly held views. I was a rebel, very stubborn, she told me. She had worked for many years as a nurse and had also engaged for a long time in various facets of community work. I'm a very social person, a very caring person. I'm a facilitator. I engage with the community. Harriet had been brought up in an extended family, and her parents had had a conventional Sikh arranged marriage in the early 1950s. They didn't see each other on the wedding day. Mum met my dad when she came to Malaysia. Neither saw each other at the wedding, so neither before the wedding nor at the wedding. In Harriet's view, she told me, these marriages last longer than the ones nowadays. They're more material now. Nowadays, she said, people don't want that. They don't trust their parents. Harriet described a happy childhood, growing up as part of a large extended family speaking both Punjabi and English. It was, she said, a mixture, happiness and laughter, grief, fights and arguments, peacemaking. I loved it. Describing how her own marriage had come about, Harriet told me, there were a lot of proposals. I didn't agree. My sister was divorced. I was earning well. I didn't want to end up like my sister. My parents went to another friend's house. My mum said, just go. We went to KL, met in a friend's house. They gave us time to talk. I said, I don't want a divorce. And I asked him, a future husband, what are you looking for? He said, only need love. I said, I don't want to end up like my sister. He said, I have 3 sisters, so he knows. In this marriage, like that of her parents, love had followed marriage rather than the other way round. We fell in love after getting married. Until today, still falling in love. You always learn new things about your partner. Harriet's narrative was threaded through with judgments about her own and her parents' marriage, as well as those of her siblings, nieces, and nephews. She said, my dad was very patriarchal, gave respect to sons, not daughters. He said, after marriage, you belong to another family. That's how I was taught. The perils of materialism were another strong theme in her account. Other weddings, she said, are very lavish. Nowadays, there's no dowry. My husband refused to take gifts my parents gave. I say, save the money. Keep it for the honeymoon, for your first house. Nowadays, they want things very lavish. I never dreamt of that. I'm not interested also. It was the negative example of her sister's marriage that had been in the forefront of her mind when she had considered the marital proposals put to her, and which influenced her later decisions too. Harriet had married in the 1990s at the age of 30, so quite late, and the couple had lived abroad to study. Her choice of degree subjects, as it slowly transpired, had been motivated by her sister's experience of domestic abuse. Over the years of marriage, there had been plenty of difficulties, including personal and health issues. When I asked about her expectations prior to getting married, Harriet said, I never had expectations when I got married. I thought that was a fairy tale. I looked up during the ceremony, so in contrast to her parents. Looking down. I wasn't shy. I didn't want to be covered. My husband then was a very quiet man. We made compromises, 2 very different people, one soul, different spirituality. I'm there to break the rules, run red lights. I enjoyed life when I got married. I'd go out with friends till 1 a.m. I'm not shy. I can dance in the road. My husband knows I'm a crazy woman. Harriet's account was peppered with opinions and evaluations about her own marriage and those of others, especially in the younger generation. She was outspoken in her critique of the ubiquitous materialism that she considered had taken hold amongst her younger relatives. Her narrative shows, too, how the marriage of a close relative could provide a powerful model of what to avoid. But Harriet's own marriage, arranged by her parents, occurring within communal boundaries, celebrated with religious rites, and emerging by her own account from a patriarchal set of norms, seemed also to encapsulate a paradox. However conventional in form, it was nevertheless possible for Harriet to draw attention to how she had been, as she said, a rebel, breaking the rules, refusing to accept the role of the demure, compliant wife, and how her husband had accommodated this, how in fact they had both accommodated each other in their marriage of many decades' duration. The tension between conformity and its refusal goes to the heart of marriage. Okay, what does all this tell us? The accounts of marriage to which I listened in Penang convey the trajectories of families through time. Talking about marriage, as Lydia's and Harriet's narratives make plain, involves reflecting on family life over several generations. Their narrations encompass judgments about how things were done in the past and how differently or similarly they are done today or might be done in the future. This evocation of the past, present, and future, the multiple temporalities of marriage, articulates but also disrupts the continuities of kinship. Continuity in kinship rests on a balance between reproducing sameness, which at the limits would create stasis, and producing difference, which at the limits would be the antithesis of continuity. Marriage has a crucial place here in the reproduction of families, balanced as it is between these two poles. In the accounts of marriage to which I listened, there was a tension between sameness and difference. If marriage necessarily introduces new and different elements into the zone of close family, too much difference poses a threat to the values and integrity of existing family life, and sometimes to wider communities, while too little difference may pose other challenges of boredom, sameness, stultification, or at the extreme, perhaps, connotations of incest. Striking the right balance of difference and sameness, often expressed in idioms of complementarity, marriage carries with it the possibilities of transformation, personal, familial, and political, alongside what may be experienced as the comfort and assurance of continuity. What we often see as continuity in kinship thus inevitably encapsulates change. In the stories of individual marriages and families recounted by Lydia and Harriet and others, these somewhat abstract considerations were experienced and expressed by individuals in the most immediate, emotionally salient, and visceral ways. The stories of Lydia's grandmother's life or of Harriet's sister, however, make clear that kinship continuity can be lived as violence and threat, rather than offering the comfort of familiarity. Conjugal relations may provide negative models of what to avoid, rather than the stuff of emulation. An expansion of horizons that marriage may offer can be read in Lydia's account of her mother's rather unlikely marriage to someone from an entirely different background, nationality, and class. This expansion was present too in many other narratives. For both Lydia's parents, marriage took them along a route less travelled, an escape from their familial backgrounds, and establishment of a new and different kind of family love. By Lydia's account, a happy one, but no doubt with its own problems and difficulties. The recurrent touchstone of creativity, that of both her parents as well as in her own marriage, is telling here. Creativity and a working partnership are at the heart of her marital story, as is the case of others, without necessarily being so clearly articulated. Through her narrative, marriage emerges as an encounter with difference that occurs on the smallest and most intimate scale, but contributes to and is part of larger historical change. The marriage of Lydia's parents incorporated and was lived alongside the geopolitical shifts of the Cold War in the form of the so-called Malayan emergency, an anti-communist war which had brought Lydia's father to Malaya from England on his compulsory military service at the very end of the colonial era. It expressed too a rejection of some of the forms of colonial and immediate post-colonial relations in which rubber extraction and production was embedded and which embargoed marriage across so-called racial lines. As is evident in Lydia and Harriet's stories, when people consider their own marriages or those of relatives or consociates, they exercise what I've called ethical imagination, as they explore how intimate relations should be lived in comparison to other marriages, past and present, with which they're familiar. This is an inherently reflective process, resting on the consideration of possible alternatives, different ways to live. It encapsulates possibilities for change, even if these are sometimes masked as continuity. Thus, Harriet sought to avoid the unhappiness and violence in her sister's marriage, which had ended in divorce. Sometimes it may mean that people like Lydia's parents, for example, take more radical, transformative steps to marry beyond the bounds of community. Marriage is a close encounter with difference on the most intimate scale that carries with it the seeds of social transformation as much as the trappings of conformity. These contradictory qualities are amplified through the deceptively obvious dual nature of marriage as at once a private, intimate relation and a public one. Both transformation and conformity matter, and they co-produce each other, just as the private and public aspects of marriage do, but partly because anthropologists and sociologists often interpret marriage and indeed kinship largely in conservative terms. I focus here on the transformative possibilities of marriage to explore how familial worlds can sometimes imperceptibly and gradually engender social transformation. The accounts of Lydia and Harriet illuminate how considering a particular marriage is entwined with comparative judgments and assessments of other marriages, those of parents, grandparents, siblings, or children, nieces and nephews. Kinship in stories that are recounted enables journeys across generations, constituting in effect a kind of time travel, as Andrew Shryock has described it. There are other noteworthy aspects of this temporal process. First, such judgments are relative. They encompass views about what may be better or worse conjugal relations, and they merge and distinguish subjective experience with what may seem to be more negative, objective stances. The consideration of past, present, and future relationships thus unfolds and generates ethical judgments and visions. I use ethical here in the very broadest sense, which may or may not carry moral overtones, as instilled in explicit rules and obligations. Sometimes, but not always, reflections about relationships may explicitly take into account the expectations, preferences, or visions of others, such as family, or wider community, or society more broadly. The dual nature of marriage as at once an intimate relation and a public one permits and even dictates sometimes imperceptible transitions between different registers of the ethical, intimate, and political. We can see this capacity in Harriet's criticisms, echoed in comments of others too, of increasing materialism and a proclivity for large, showy weddings among today's young people. In the accounts to which I listened, the ethical or moral was not a separate domain of isolated individual consideration, but pertains to relationships and to ordinary or everyday life. Kinship relations, as has been emphasized by James Fabian and Robert McKinley, amongst others, are an obvious arena for moral or ethical considerations, partly because of the altruism and consideration of close others that expectations and ideologies of kinship demand. For most people, kinship, as it is lived and imagined, is a realm of the everyday that is suffused with ethics. Here, Cheryl Mattingly's evocation of the moral laboratories in which African-American parents in Los Angeles reach decisions about what may be best for their children against a backdrop of heavy constraints is apt. It's worth noting here that marriage encompasses ethical work that, as well as being implicit and ongoing, embedded in the relational practices of a marriage, is also sometimes explicit and performative. For example, at the vital conjunctures, Johnson Hanks's term, such as deciding whom to marry or what kind of wedding to hold. The productive tension between these aspects of the ethical work of marriage, encompassing varied attitudes to sameness and difference, conformity and change, are part of the transformative potentialities of marriage. Ethical work may be directed simultaneously or separately at an expansion of relational personhood for the individual, at enhancement of family relations and status, and also towards broader communal concerns. In fact, these different aims and spheres, rather than being necessarily contradictory, may be mobilized to enable each other. Amara Maqsood's recent subtle and beautifully evoked exposition of how middle-class women in Pakistan navigate the constraints of patriarchal authority within the existing norms of joint families to negotiate new marital possibilities is a case in point. Rather than seeing familiar authority structures as simply enforcing constraints and limitations on women, Maqsood shows how, and I quote, desire is also opening up space to renegotiate relations in marriage, where women tacitly explore new kinds of expectations in married life. Importantly, in a context of very limited options here, such expansions of zones of possibility come about not by means of direct challenges to authority, but through what Maqsood calls traditional practices. Nevertheless, they reflect a sense of hope and transformative desire, she tells us. In focusing on the importance of ethical imagination in marriage, I've taken inspiration from the work of a literary historian called Phyllis Rowe, who worked on 5 Victorian literary marriages. Through a feminist lens, Rose analyzes marriage as what she calls imaginative projections and arrangements of power. While both power and imagination might be considered fundamental to understanding marriage, imagination has, I think, been much less touched on by anthropologists. The significance of imaginative capacities for kinship is, of course, not restricted to marital relations alone. In a very different context, Raina Rapp and Faye Ginsberg explore how parenting children with disabilities in the US brings about an expansion of kinship horizons for parents, and I quote, widens the space of possibility in which relations can be imagined and resources claimed. The connections that Rapp and Ginsberg draw between kinship and political activism provide insights into how familial kinship may generate political change. For those I interviewed and spoke to in Penang, considering intergenerational marital experiences in their own families meant above all reflecting on gender relations between wives and husbands. Here, the most marked and most commented upon change over 2 or 3 generations has been the increasing tendency of women to achieve tertiary education before marriage and after marriage to continue to work outside the home. Women whose mothers worked or who themselves work, in contrast to their mothers or grandmothers, were described as more independent, more autonomous, and having more equal relations with their husbands. This fundamental shift and the way it was spoken about by women and men indicates too the expansion of imaginative horizons entailed, particularly for women, about their own life course as well as those of their female forebears. But it prompted men too to imaginatively reconsider their own ideals and expectations of women and wives in past, present, and future, as they articulated these to me in conversations and interviews. Imagination does not, however, always imply an expansion of possibilities, and there are limits and constraints to the potential for transformation. One area of possible change that is very controversial in Malaysia is LGBTQ rights, which is anathema to more conservative Muslims for whom it has the capacity to be attached to and galvanize anti-Western attitudes, but is more acceptable in some form to many young urban middle-class liberals. This fracture, which starkly contrasts with radical changes in the acceptance of same-sex relations in Europe and North America, opens up questions about the political possibilities of intimate relations or their perceived capacities for change. The trajectories of women for whom marriage has provided an ambivalent template for gender relations, some of whom have remained or become unmarried, may connect their experiences to engagement in different kinds of community service, as well as activism in women's rights and LGBTQ contexts. The direct impact of family relations has propelled some women to devote time and energy to the service of wider improvements of marital and gender relations. Putting these ethnographic stories side by side with insights about ordinary ethics, imagination, and time illuminates how political change may be generated through sometimes negative conjugal and familial experience. I'm going to move out of that zone now and talk a little bit about ways of doing research. Before moving to tie together the themes of the research on marriage with those of my earlier work, I want to step back for a moment to say a few words about the way this research emerged and how it was carried out. The work was part of an ERC-funded project, which was titled rather grandiosely, A Global Anthropology of Transforming Marriage. And it was carried out in 5 different places with my collaborators who are listed there. So completely different context. Rural Botswana in the context of HIV/AIDS epidemic, that was Corinne Rees. Taiwan and China in the context of 2 very different political systems and the kinship connections between them, that was Xiao Chu. Athens in the context of economic austerity, Irini Papadakis' work. Urban Virginia in the US at a time of heightened political, legal, and religious contestations, so in the Trump presidency, by Siobhan McGee, and my own project in urban Penang, looking at marriage through processes of middle classification and other changes that have occurred over the last 40 years or so since I first began doing fieldwork in Malaysia. The project began with the idea that in spite of its apparent obviousness, we don't know as much about what marriage actually does and how as we might think. Anthropologists and sociologists have tended to think of marriage as a conservative and normative institution, central to reproducing a hierarchical and gendered order. Significantly, perhaps, marriage has been largely omitted from what some have called the new kinship studies in favor of a focus on birth and reproduction. We also tend to think of it as reactive, altering in the context of legal, economic, or politically instituted changes. But what if we were to turn these assumptions around? What if we were to consider how marriage itself might be an engine of social transformation from the inside, as it were, and then take seriously the notion that state institutions respond to more intimate, familial, and communal shifts in practices and attitudes. The legal enactments enabling same-sex marriage in some parts of the world might be a case in point. These have been some of the most unpredicted and profound changes that have occurred in my lifetime. It seems unconvincing to see these as simply the outcome of political or legislative diktats imposed on family love. On the contrary, a complex process of attitudinal and relational shifts in intimate family contexts, together with gendered political activism generated at least in part from personal and familial experience, would need to be part of any plausible account of how these changes have occurred. But as anthropologists and as experts in kinship, we know too little about the interplay of such processes. And because following this logic, change that is generated through everyday experience often occurs in small and unremarkable ways over quite long time spans that may encompass intergenerational relations, it's often difficult to track. While some of the questions from which we began can be traced back to my earlier research in Langkawi, the mode of working and the context were very different. Working in kinship in urban rather than rural surroundings required more reliance on interviews and less opportunities for simply spending time hanging out in people's houses. To be sure, I had useful knowledge on marriage and kinship in Malaysia on which to draw, but this was of varying relevance depending on the background of those to whom I spoke. So in the case of non-Malay interlocutors, I was sort of starting from the beginning, as it were. Then there was my age. No longer a neophyte researcher, but more or less an old lady in Malaysian terms, and certainly of grandparental generation. On the whole, I found this an advantage, and I can quite recommend for those of you envisaging a career as field workers, being an old lady for fieldwork purposes. The counterpart to this is that in the village in Langkawi, I had often found being a young woman irksome and constraining, especially when my comportment or behaviour were corrected, or I was sharply reminded to carry out some domestic chore in the house in which I was living in the manner customary for young Malay unmarried women. What was most different about our marriage project, however, was the collaboration in which it was rooted. Our projects provided material with which to test ideas and allow them to grow. Comparisons between our very different geographic, historical, and cultural fields encourage a creative experimental tacking between these sites, adopting and adapting analytic frames or suggestive possibilities in a spirit of intellectual give and take. This shared ethnographic laboratory was in sharp contrast with the lone doctoral student conducting fieldwork in a rural village in the 1980s in relative isolation and without, of course, mobile phones or emails. Different eras, different places, different ages, and not least different modes of funding have thus co-produced different modes of working. There are also broader questions that I take up in the larger work from which this lecture is drawn, including some that go beyond my scope here. Research on marriage in contemporary urban Malaysia, as I've described to you, inevitably drew me back to my first fieldwork on kinship and marriage on the island of Langkawi in rural Malaysia more than 40 years ago. And so reflecting on doing anthropology over time has been woven through writing about both processes of marriage and of doing research. The difficult questions of how we can do anthropology now in the increasingly fraught zones in which we find ourselves are more and more perturbing. As Anand Pandian has asked, what constitutes a possible anthropology for our times? Part of the importance of marriage, as I've related, is that inevitably it brings a close encounter with the other or with difference into the heart of kinship. This encounter may be destructive or productive or both, but it means that marriage is never simply about reproducing what is already there, but also about inserting new elements into the apparent continuity of kinship. As an intimate encounter with difference, it has struck me, especially when considering how I began my first fieldwork, but also learning and teaching over many years, that doing anthropology bears some parallels with marriage. At its most ambitious, anthropology carries the hope of political transformation through its fieldwork, encounters, and through pedagogical experience. And so I'm interested in putting this parallel to work to consider how the lens of marriage might shed new light on doing anthropology now, as well as on processes of long-term anthropological research. What about another 5 minutes? Is that okay? So take your time. So far, I've focused on two projects, my first and my most recent, to consider the generativity of everyday kinship and relatedness through space and time. Before concluding, I want also to say something about two other pieces of research that have bearing on the themes I'm discussing here, though perhaps a little more tangential. One of these was in some ways the precursor of my research on marriage in Penang, at least in the sense that it too was carried out in multi-ethnic contexts in urban Penang. But focus here was on a very special material object, blood. And the work was carried out in hospital blood banks, clinical pathology labs, and community blood donation sites. The research set out to interrogate the plasticity of blood, its exceptionally varied meanings and symbolic registers as it moves between different domains and sites, medical, religious, kinship, and political. How do these meanings stop or flow between the boundaries of such different domains? How, in the distinctly medical and technologized contexts of donation, screening, separation, and storage of blood and its products and of transfusion, are the more arcane or symbolic registers of blood kept at bay? The questions were originally excited by probing the way that blood is in many cultures, including Malay and many European cultures, a central symbol of kinship. But questions broadened out to include the political and religious connotations of blood, as well as the medical. And of course, they could hardly avoid the materiality of blood, its unique physical properties that seem somehow to encompass and also contribute to its polysemic qualities. The work on blood came to have time and space at its core. The different spaces of the hospitals in Penang, as well as the educational, kinship, and employment histories of those who worked in these spaces. And they were crucial to building an understanding of blood's unique properties. But time was also central to this story, as it was possible to trace our historical meanings of blood, for example, those derived from humoral medicine, far from being shed or confined to some earlier period, could be suddenly expressed in the midst of highly technologized and up-to-date laboratory spaces. Working on blood and subsequently on marriage enabled me to renew my connections with Malaysia many years after my original fieldwork there, but in a way that took account of Malaysia's rapid processes of urbanization and expansion of middle classes since the 1980s. Conceptually linked to the Blood Project, an earlier project had taken as its starting point the prevalence of fostering in Malay kinship and the possibilities it allowed for maintaining birth ties simultaneously with those of fostering. Comparing this to the much more exclusive nature of birth and adoption in the UK, in the late 1990s, I conducted a small piece of research on what happened when adult adoptees in Scotland sought out and met their birth parents and siblings, from whom they'd been conceptually disconnected in infancy. The project had questions about nature and nurture at its core. Our Malay kinship seemed to hinge on gradual processes of becoming kin through living together and shared feeding in a house. Kinship in the UK apparently derived from a more categorical vision of procreation and birth as the unique sources of kinship. Contrary to expectations, however, when I spoke to the adoptees who had met their birth kin, they were keen to emphasize the long-term work and care that is necessary to create proper kinship. Parents worthy of the name, they told me, were those who had invested time and effort into bringing up their children, creating memories nurtured in childhood. So this project, like the one on blood, brought to the fore too the importance of material objects, here letters, photographs, and other treasured items, and of the memories they condense, themes that have run through all the work I've referred to here. I've got a quite short conclusion. It's time to bring the themes I've been discussing together and to draw this talk to a close. I spoke at the beginning about the generativity of everyday kinship and relatedness, processes I learned about from the intimate vantage point of the Malay house in which I lived and others where I was a frequent visitor in the 1980s. This was a privileged entry point, one more customary in an earlier era of anthropological fieldwork. It was possible to learn a lot from it, but undoubtedly it had its downsides too, some of which I've alluded to here. If the central concerns that emerged from that work have remained constant, they've been increasingly complemented by an awareness of the importance of memory and history, and the way memories are laid down in childhood through processes of living together, shared meals, objects, spaces, and experiences that may be passed between those who intimately engage with each other, as well as connecting to earlier generations. As the recent work on marriage that I've spoken about here tries to show, kinship is far from being only about conformity and normativity, or about continuity in social life. Marriage has a unique place in introducing difference and change into the heart of kinship. As we've witnessed in recent decades in Europe, marriage has an astonishing capacity to shapeshift under the guise of what is normal or expected, partly indeed by wearing the mask of conformity. The ethical imagination that intimate relations, perhaps especially marriage, requires of participants is itself a creative process of transformation at the heart of kinship. Cumulatively and over time, it can precipitate wider political transformation. Neither Lydia nor Harriet, whose accounts I drew on earlier, were political activists. Nevertheless, as older women, both were highly engaged in community life in their worlds in Penang. In one sense, ordinary, in that neither had achieved exceptional fame or status, one could equally well say that both were remarkable in the way that many life stories, when examined closely, reveal extraordinary conjunctures, qualities, and talents, resilience, or tenacity. Both women showed a disposition to reflect on their own marriage and those of others through time and generations. This exercise of relational and moral imagination is at once completely ordinary and also, through the possibilities it engenders to create and absorb change, transformative. It expresses the generativity of the everyday that is at the heart of kinship and relatedness as intimate and deeply political relations. That's it.